Okay.
Okay, here we go. Today, we will do the executive and the judicial branch. Executive branch. The job of the executive branch is to do what? With laws.
Just kidding. Am I right?
No, that'll just be good on the
Oh.
legislative branch does what to laws? Makes laws. The executive branch does what? Enforces laws. Good.
Yeah.
Okay. So, the head of the executive branch is whom? President. Okay. President will serve for your term. President must be at least 35 years old. So if you notice that we've gone from 25 for the House of Representatives, 30 for the Senate, 35 for the President. Yeah.
Has any president actually been like 35 years old?
The youngest president is either Kennedy or Obama, and I never remember which it is. I think it was Kennedy. Who was in his early 40s, I think. Right? Yeah. Let's look it up.
How old is Trump?
Trump is our oldest president, 72. Oldest to be elected, oldest to have their first election. Kennedy was 42. I think Obama was 43 or 44. So, you have to have been a resident of the United States. Was he?
Oh wait. 40.
So you must have lived in the United States for 14 years, and you must be native born. You cannot be an immigrant to the United States and be the president. So you must be born in the United States, or you could have been born in a foreign country if you are born on a naval base or if you have American parents, but you must be a native-born citizen. Okay? The president is elected through the Electoral College. The Electoral College is set up with 540 votes. These are the number of senators plus a couple other regions, Washington, D.C. Being an example. You must get 271 in order to pass. So the way the Electoral College works is that each state nominates electors. When the state, yeah, 540. That's a good number to know. 271 to win. So if it's 270 to 270, that ends up being a tie in the Electoral College. We'll talk about what happens if there's a tie. Yeah, I got to have 271. Yep. What happens is the electors agree to vote the way the state does. They are not actually required to, though. So in theory, an elector could, if Minnesota was to have voted for, we voted for Hillary Clinton, and if the elector was really into Trump, he could have, in theory, he or she could have voted for Trump. Don't know if it's ever happened, but that is a option. You have the vice president, that is second in command. It used to be that, and we'll talk about this later this week, it used to be that the way it was set up that the president would be the person who got the most electoral votes, and the vice president was the person who got the second most electoral votes. You can see right off the bat why that is a problem. So, for example, if that law was still going on, our vice president today would be Hillary Clinton, and our president would be Donald Trump, and you can just sort of see the... but that is what happened with our second presidency, with Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And so they changed that to now where they are running on the same ticket as the same people. Yeah.
So for the vice president is a part of the executive branch and the legislative branch.
Say it again.
The vice president is for the executive branch and the legislative.
So he's the head of the Senate. So that is one of the checks that comes in there, but he is considered part of the executive branch, right? The vice president must also be a natural-born citizen, right? So that has to happen as well. Succession of the presidency. If the president dies, all right, the way it goes is you will go the vice president. After the vice president, you have the Speaker of the House. After the Speaker of the House, you have the President pro tempore of the Senate. President.
Again?
The President pro tempore is the title of that position. And that is a position that is not necessarily the most important position in the Senate. It's an elected position by senators, so that's not, as we know, the president of the Senate is the vice president. Following that, it ends up being the Secretary of State. After that, you have the cabinets in order on which they were founded. So we talked about those original cabinet positions. That's where you go. Obviously, we have never gotten past vice president in our succession. Where we see this actually coming into play is if you are thinking about like the State of the Union address or an inauguration, what they will always do is they will have someone in the presidential line of succession not present at the speech and will be at an undisclosed safe location. The idea being that if something was that, if there was a bomb to be dropped in the Capitol and everyone was to die, there would be somebody that would be able to take over. There was a show on Fox that starred Keanu Reeves that was what it's called, like Designated Survivor or something like that. I never watched. Did you watch it? Is it good? Is it better than 24? Never seen 24. 24 is great. So, jobs of the president. Okay? He is he's commander-in-chief of the military. So he is in charge of the military. He can approve and veto laws. Talked about that. He makes treaties with foreign governments. He nominates judges. To the Supreme Court. And he appoints cabinet members. All of these have checks. If he vetoes a law, who can override the veto? 2/3 of Congress. He makes treaties with foreign governments. Who ratifies the treaties?
Should we write this down?
This is what we did yesterday. More specifically, who in Congress? Which branch? Senate or the House? Senate. Good. Who approves the nominations to the Supreme Court? Senate. Who approves the cabinet members? There's a pattern here. The Senate, right. So the Senate is able to check all of these powers. Okay? He will give a State of the Union address we talked about. He can also be impeached. There are only 3 ways that the president, in theory, can be impeached. that are listed in the Constitution. They are treason, bribery, and then high crimes and misdemeanors. When Bill Clinton was impeached, he was found to have not committed treason, bribery, or any high crimes. He was not particularly moral. He was not particularly ethical, but he did not break any of these rules. Thus, he was found not guilty of his impeachment. Andrew Johnson, who was also impeached, was also found to not be guilty of these. Thus, no one has been convicted of it. The two people that have been impeached is Andrew Johnson, following the Civil War, and Bill Clinton. So when we hear people saying we need to impeach Trump, right? And there was calls to impeach Obama, and there were calls to impeach George W. Bush. The question becomes, has he committed any of these crimes?
Wait, why did people want to impeach Obama? Or like, what was the argument for that?
Because they thought that he was born in a different country. They thought, there were all kinds of accusations
it wasn't, like, serious,
that none of them fit the crime. Exactly. For Bush, it was because we got involved in the war in Iraq. And you can make mistakes as the president, but that does not fall under, So for Trump, you can find him to be vulgar, and you can find him to be, off-putting and all these things. But if he doesn't commit treason, bribery, or high crimes or misdemeanors, that's it. Now, if it was to come out that he was working with the Russians in his election, then all of a sudden you can start talking about these things. But there has to be a really high level to cross to make that happen.
Will that qualify as treason?
Depends on what he did.
Wait, so if that happened and they found out that the VP was involved, and would it automatically go to the Speaker of the House?
No. So the House of Representatives must vote to impeach him. So even if they find out,
The Vice President was involved.
so what would happen is they would probably impeach the president first. The vice president would come up and they would name someone else as the vice president. That's a good question if they did it at the same time. I don't think they would because it's an individual piece. So for Nixon, the vice president resigned. Gerald Ford was named vice president. Then Nixon resigned, and thus Gerald Ford became president. So Gerald Ford's the only president that never was elected president. Good little piece of trivia. Okay, any other questions about that? Good? Judicial branch. If the legislative branch makes laws, if the executive branch enforces law, what does the judicial branch do? Interprets laws. Good. All right, so they interpret law. Okay. The only court created by the Constitution was the Supreme Court. It's the only one, as we talked about. The federal courts are the other things. So let's talk about what you have with the Supreme Court. Justices serve for life or until they retire. The idea behind this is that you do not want the judges to be facing political pressure to make decisions. And we have seen there have been justices that have been named by conservative presidents that have ended up being pretty liberal, and vice versa. So you never quite know what you're going to get when you have a president. These guys, they can declare laws unconstitutional or constitutional for that matter. Settle disputes involving the United States and other countries, and also they can do it between states. So if Minnesota and Wisconsin had a beef, we can do that.
What happens if like a justice like does something illegal Like, do they get kicked off?
So you cannot. So if they went ahead and committed a crime, I don't know. I don't think you can be forced out. If you get arrested, but I don't think they can force you out for that reason.
What do you mean justice?
So a justice is the people who are on the Supreme Court.
Like,
So there are 9 justices,
and they serve for their whole life till they die?
or until they retire.
Can they
Which is why you have like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's like 84. She's still there, and you have, these guys can serve, and that's also why when you get someone like Gorsuch, who gets put on by Trump, who's in his late 40s or early 50s, he in theory is going to be on the Supreme Court now for 30 to 40 years, right? So you get a pretty conservative justice that is going to be there for a long time. Previously, in like the 1800s, you get people put in on the Supreme Court in their 60s, and they're going to only live for another 10 or the average lifespan. So you get turnover. Now the turnover is much less. The other question?
Oh, can they retire like whenever they want to?
Mm-hmm. But if you retire, you're giving up a pretty good job.
What do you mean pretty good?
And being on the Supreme Court's a good job.
Like, how much do you
You make a lot. And then you can go speak for big money, and you also have an enormous amount of power. I mean, think about the power you have as a Supreme Court justice, right? We talked about, sorry.
Does the Senate have to approve, like, if the president appoints someone?
Yep, President appoints, Senate approves. And they have had Supreme Court justices not get approved. For example, Merrick Garland, right? Merrick Garland, by Obama, was nominated, and the Senate said we're not going to approve or deny because they wanted the next president to make the decision. So if you talk to a Democrat, they will say that the Republicans stole that seat from Merrick Garland and ended up giving it to Gorsuch, who is a very conservative justice. We talked about how the House impeaches, the Senate tries the impeachment. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which is John Roberts right now, he presides over impeachment trials. So all branches of government are involved in the impeachment process. All 3 branches, the House, the Senate, and the judicial branch.
I have 2 questions. One, does the Chief Justice say the Chief presides? And
Yes.
also, what if, can they, impeach people on the justice?
No, it's only impeachment's only for the executive branch. And for the Chief Justice, it's an interesting thing. If the Chief Justice resigns, then the new guy that comes in becomes the Chief Justice. So John Roberts is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, even though he is not the most senior member of the Supreme Court. It's an interesting.
Never mind.
Okay. The only law that is listed in the Constitution under the judicial branch is treason. That is the only one. Okay?
Wait. What? Can you say that again?
Yep, so the only law that is listed, the only thing that can break the law in the Constitution is treason. It's the only thing that's specifically listed in there. It doesn't mean it's the only crime that people commit.
Wait, what do you mean by that?
So going against the country, what treason means, or what is it?
No, what do you mean?
So in the judicial branch, the only law that they have in there,
Wait, it's the only law that can.
the only law that is listed specifically in the Constitution is treason. So it's the only one. There's nothing about murder. There's nothing about financial crimes.
Those are all amendments.
So those all become issues that are having to be done elsewhere, either in states or either in a federal law or something like that. But the only one that's listed in the Constitution is treason. And the important thing about treason is that if I commit treason, I am the only one that will be charged with this. It cannot impact my wife, my kids, my descendants. The treason is only for the person who is committing that treason.
So is treason the only one listed under the judicial?
In the entire Supreme Court. or in the entire Constitution. All right, that's it. Because you'd think in a judicial branch you'd have a list of things that were illegal to do. The only thing they have is treason. Right? Extradition. If you commit a crime in a state and you run to the other state, to another state, so if I kill Bella in Minnesota and then I go to Wisconsin, if Minnesota asks for me to be sent back, Wisconsin must send me back to that state. They cannot hold me. They cannot harbor me there. They also have a deal that says that states will respect one another's laws. Last thing today. Second last thing, pardon me. Federal supremacy. What this means is that federal law trumps state laws. So right now, marijuana is legal in Colorado and Washington. The reason why it is being allowed right now is because the federal government has said we are not going to crack down on it. Marijuana is illegal in the federal government. If they chose to, they could go in and they could shut down all of the marijuana distributions in those states. That's why it's a cash-only business. So you can't use a credit card to buy weed in these states because they cannot have any relationship to the federal government. So that's how that works. What's that?
I was kidding.
Okay. What did you ask? Though?
No, I said good to know.
Oh yeah, yeah. Got to bring cash.
Is it legal in Minnesota?
No.
Okay.
Medicinal marijuana is, but not recreational. Not recreational. All right. Last thing today: how to amend the Constitution. All right. How to change it. Okay. There are two ways that you can do it: to amend it, to propose it.
Wait, what did you say?
In order to propose an amendment to the Constitution, two ways that this works. 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate. Okay, so 2/3 in both, or a national convention called by 2/3 of state legislatures. Okay? So you got to have a lot of people to propose it, to ratify it. So that means to pass it. It must be ratified by legislatures in 3/4 of the states, or conventions in 3/4 of the states. Which tells us that in order to amend the Constitution, who is going to have the final say in these? States, right? So in order to ratify this, the states must speak. So this is why it is extremely hard to pass a constitutional amendment. It's designed to be really, really hard to do so. There have been, as we said, a total of 27 amendments. And those 27 we will look at tomorrow. Yes, question?
How do you get how do you get rid of them? Like what's that?
To get rid of an amendment, you have to go through the same thing. So once it's in, like with prohibition, they got prohibition to go, and then they had to propose another amendment to get rid of it. So once it's in the Constitution, you have to go through the same process to get rid of it.
So like 2/3 of people. Okay.
Yeah, it's hard to. It's really a challenge to do it. That's design. Other questions?